That Tuesday afternoon, the House Judiciary Committee hearing room was filled to capacity. Reporters, staffers, and onlookers occupied every seat, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. At the witness table sat Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to Donald Trump and an architect of several controversial immigration policies, his jaw tight, scanning the committee like a hawk, surveying its territory. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas adjusted her microphone. Her posture was composed, but her expression carried a clear determination. Over the next 30 minutes, Miller would interrupt her 6 times, each interruption sharper than the last. But it would be Crockett's 7th statement, measured and precise, that silenced him completely and shifted the tone of the entire hearing. The exchange went viral within minutes, garnering millions of views and sparking a national debate about respect, authority, and who truly shapes the political conversation in Washington. Before we dive into this powerful confrontation that captured the nation's attention, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our detailed coverage of pivotal political moments. We appreciate hearing from engaged citizens across the country who care about truth and accountability. So, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. To understand why this moment became so explosive, it's important to know who these two figures are and why their clash was almost inevitable from the moment Miller took his seat. By 38, Stephen Miller had built his entire career around being the unyielding voice of hardline immigration policy. He helped design some of the most controversial measures of the Trump administration as his senior advisor and chief speechwriter, including the family separation policy at the border and the travel ban targeting Muslim-majority nations. Known in Washington for his combative nature and unrelenting debating style, Miller was rarely caught off guard. He faced senators, journalists, and critics with the same method, speaking quickly, dominating conversations, and never admitting fault. Facing him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who had quickly earned a reputation as one of the sharpest and most fearless questioners in Congress. At 42, Crockett brought both courtroom skill and moral conviction. A former civil rights attorney and public defender, she was experienced in handling hostile witnesses. She also understood what it meant to fight harder to be heard, a perspective shaped by her background and the community she served. Her district covered parts of Dallas and nearby suburbs, areas deeply affected by the immigration policies Miller had helped craft. The stakes for the hearing could not have been higher. The Judiciary Committee was examining the long-term consequences of Trump-era immigration actions, particularly the family separation policy that tore thousands of children from their parents at the southern border. Recently released documents revealed that officials were aware of the emotional and psychological harm it would cause, but chose to proceed anyway. Miller had been summoned to testify about his role in creating and implementing those directives. For Miller, this hearing was about protecting his reputation and defending policies he continued to view as essential for national security. He came prepared with statistics, rehearsed talking points, and his trademark combative confidence. To him, this was another opportunity to justify his version of immigration reform rooted in deterrence and strict enforcement. For Crockett, however, the issue was deeply personal. She had toured detention centers, met with separated families, and witnessed firsthand the trauma inflicted on children. And as a black woman in Congress, she also recognized a familiar dynamic, being talked over, interrupted, or dismissed by powerful men. Throughout her career, she had encountered figures like Miller, those who mistook aggression for authority and interruption for intellect. The committee room radiated tension. Behind Miller sat his legal team and advisors, all in dark suits with serious expressions. Behind Crockett, her staff sat alongside immigration advocates, some of whom had personally suffered under Miller's policies. A few wore shirts bearing images of separated families. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to cover the hearing live, cameras capturing every detail. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan brought the session to order promptly at 2 p.m. Though maintaining decorum proved difficult amid the packed audience, Democrats were ready to press Miller on his record. Republicans were prepared to defend him and shift focus to current border challenges, but everyone knew the most anticipated exchange would come between Miller and Crockett. For the first 20 minutes, tension built. Several Democrats had questioned Miller, but he handled each encounter predictably, dodging questions, talking over opponents, and reverting to rehearsed defenses. Republican members offered friendly questions, allowing him to reinforce his stance as a misunderstood patriot. None had managed to pierce his defenses. Then, Chairman Jordan announced, "The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Miss Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in. Crockett leaned toward her microphone, her tone steady and confident. "Mr. Miller," she began. "Thank you for being here today. I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy caused documented psychological harm to thousands of children?" Miller's reply came instantly, his words sharp and quick. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was about border security." Before he could continue, Crockett interjected. "Mr. Miller," but he talked over her. "The real trauma," he pressed on, "comes from human traffickers exploiting these children and from prior administration's policies that encouraged illegal crossings." Crockett raised her voice slightly, still composed. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking about the specific documented trauma." Miller interrupted again, leaning toward his microphone, his tone rising. "The documentation you're referencing comes from biased sources that ignore the broader context." "Mr. Miller," Crockett said firmly. "This is my time and I would appreciate." He cut in again, voice firm. "The border crisis was created by years of failed policies that President Trump and I were trying to fix. People like you." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Chairman Jordan gave a half-hearted tap of his gavel. "The witness will allow the member to ask her questions." Miller leaned back slightly, his jaw tight, eyes locked on Crockett. She stayed calm, flipping through her papers as though his interruptions were mere distractions. "Mr. Miller," she resumed, "I have here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services stating that family separation would cause, and I quote, significant and lasting psychological damage to children. This is your administration's assessment. Do you dispute this?" Miller launched into another deflection. "What I dispute is the idea that we didn't care about children when, in fact, the memo clearly states." Crockett tried to continue, but Miller pressed on. "The Obama administration built the cages. They separated families, too. They just didn't admit that real border enforcement requires tough decisions." The crowd grew restless. Several Democratic members shook their heads. Even some Republicans appeared uneasy at Miller's aggressive tone. Crockett remained composed, jotting notes on her pad as Miller continued his lengthy monologue. When he finally paused, she spoke quickly. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have your talking points, but I'm referring to documents from your administration." Miller nearly shouted his response. "My administration. My administration saved lives. We stopped child trafficking that you seem to ignore." Crockett turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that the witness be reminded to allow me to use my time to ask questions." Jordan tapped his gavel again weakly. "Mr. Miller, please let the Congresswoman ask her questions." Miller sat back, face flushed, gripping the edge of the table. The atmosphere was tense, cameras clicked rapidly, and journalists tweeted updates in real time. Crockett met his gaze, her tone steady as steel. "Mr. Miller, I've been a civil rights attorney. I've been a public defender. I've stood in courtrooms across this country, and I have never." Miller interrupted again, leaning forward with a smirk. "Your courtroom experience doesn't qualify you to speak on national security or border enforcement. Congresswoman, the reality is." But this time, Crockett didn't interrupt or appeal to the chairman. She simply sat back, arms crossed, and waited. Miller continued for nearly 30 seconds. His voice echoed through the chamber as he ranted about border policy, trafficking, and so-called democratic failures. When he finally stopped, perhaps expecting another challenge, Crockett stayed silent. 1 beat, 2 beats. The silence was thick, almost tangible. Every person in the room leaned forward. Then she spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that commanded attention. The room was so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning was audible. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she leaned forward, hands folded neatly on the desk, her gaze locked on Stephen Miller with an intensity that made several people in the gallery hold their breath. Mr. Miller, she began, her voice calm but firm, carrying clearly across the room. You've interrupted me 6 times now. 6 times you've shown this committee, the American people watching and everyone here exactly who you are. Miller started to reply, but Crockett raised a single finger and something in her expression made him stop. You see, she continued, her voice steady but growing stronger. Men like you have been interrupting women like me all our lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice matters more. You interrupt because you think loudness equals authority. You interrupt because deep down you know that if you had to answer my questions honestly, if you had to face the evidence of the harm you caused to thousands of children, your carefully built narrative would collapse like a house of cards in a storm. The room fell silent. Miller's face went from red to pale. His lawyers sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Crockett began pulling document after document from her folder, placing them neatly on the table as she spoke. Let me explain what these papers actually say, Mr. Miller. Since you've made it difficult for me to question you properly. This memo from your deputy at Health and Human Services confirms that children as young as 8 months old were separated from their mothers. 8 months old. This report from your own Customs and Border Protection shows there was Northwest system in place to reunite families. None. And this email chain, which includes your name, shows you dismissing psychological concerns because, and I quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations. She paused, looking directly at him. Miller gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Other considerations, Crockett repeated quietly, her tone low but cutting. Those other considerations were children, Mr. Miller. Babies, toddlers, kids who will carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. And you knew it. You all knew it. And you did it anyway. The gallery erupted. Some people wept. Others nodded in agreement. Chairman Jordan banged his gavel, calling for order, but Crockett wasn't finished. What truly matters, Mr. Miller, she continued, her voice now stronger, is that you can interrupt me, talk over me, try to belittle me, but I am still here. Those children are still suffering. Those families remain broken. And you're still responsible. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on him, and delivered the line that would soon go viral. You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller, but you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your actions. Interrupting me 6 times won't change the fact that history has already judged you and found you lacking. Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were taken from, and no amount of interruptions will ever drown that out. The room exploded with noise. Miller's face turned ghostly white. His mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. For the first time in his public career, Stephen Miller was completely speechless. His attorneys whispered frantically, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on Crockett, a mix of disbelief and unease in his eyes. The gallery was in chaos. People stood and applauded. Reporters typed furiously, and the C-SPAN camera zoomed in on Miller's expression, capturing his stunned silence. Chairman Jordan pounded his gavel again, shouting for order, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. Several Democratic members stood and clapped, and even a few Republicans appeared unsettled by the exchange. Crockett sat still, hands folded, her face calm. She had used only 3 of her 5 allotted minutes, but she was done. She had said everything that needed to be said. When quiet finally returned, Chairman Jordan asked softly, Mr. Miller, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's statements? Miller leaned toward his microphone. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and uncertain, a far cry from the assertive tone he had carried all day. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration. We were protecting America. The words fell flat. Everyone in the room could hear the weakness. Miller knew it, too. The man who built his reputation on dominance and control had just been dismantled by a freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett's closing words were simple but final. Mr. Chairman, she said calmly, I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Miller's silence speaks louder than anything else. As she yielded back, the silence in the room said more than any words could. Then something remarkable happened. Members of the gallery began to stand and applaud. It wasn't a loud, frenzied applause heard earlier, but a slow, deliberate clapping that spread steadily through the room. Even a few Republicans on the committee shifted uneasily, avoiding Miller's gaze. Miller sat motionless at the witness table, his once organized notes scattered in front of him, completely forgotten. His team of lawyers and advisors behind him looked equally shocked. They had prepared him for every possible line of questioning and every potential attack on his record. But they hadn't prepared for this, for Crockett to turn his own interruptions and hostility into evidence of his character, delivering a calm, decisive takedown that left him with no path to recover. The silence stretched on, heavy with tension. Miller's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over. The man who once stood at the White House podium defending the indefensible with unwavering confidence now looked like he wished to disappear. Representative Ted Lieu, next in line for questioning, leaned toward his microphone and said simply, "Mr. Chairman, I think Ms. Crockett has said everything that needs to be said. I yield my time." One by one, other Democratic members followed suit. It was unheard of. Each member giving up their time to question one of the most controversial figures of the Trump administration, but they understood that nothing they could add would carry more weight than what had just unfolded. Each yielding of time chipped away at what was left of Miller's composure. By the time Chairman Jim Jordan called for a recess, Miller looked like a boxer still standing, only because he hadn't yet realized the fight was over. As the room began to clear, he remained seated, staring blankly at the table. His team surrounded him, whispering reassurances he barely seemed to hear. In just 3 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done what years of criticism, protests, and media scrutiny had failed to do. She had stripped away the facade of righteousness Miller had built around himself, exposing the cruelty behind his policies. Within minutes, video clips began to spread online. "Crockett destroys Miller" was trending worldwide. Her piercing line, "Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from," was shared millions of times, turned into memes, and painted on protest signs. But inside that hearing room, there was only silence. Stephen Miller, the architect of family separation and a man who had never met a microphone he couldn't dominate, now sat defeated, while Jasmine Crockett calmly gathered her papers and walked out, head held high. If you found this deep dive insightful, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more thoughtful analysis of moments that shape democracy. Share this video with others who believe in truth and accountability. Comment below with your thoughts. What other moments should we examine next? Remember, in the fight for truth and justice, every voice matters. The real question is, will we use ours as powerfully as Jasmine Crockett did that day? The choice is ours. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never let anyone interrupt your truth.